Alrighty. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the MICCAI Fellow Talk Series. My name is Pinkun Yan. I'm a professor of biomedical engineering at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, located in Troy, New York. It's my great pleasure to host this webinar together with my MICCAI board member colleague, Dr. Martina Giannaro from Imperial College London. So this webinar series highlights the work and insights of MICCAI Fellows. As you know, MICCAI Fellows are a small and distinguished group of MICCAI members who have made significant scientific contributions to the field, as well as dedicated service to the MICCAI Society. Today, we are super excited to have Professor Stephen Pizer as our MICCAI Fellow speaker. Dr. Pizer is a Kenan Professor of Computer Science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Professor Pizer is a pioneer of medical image computing. His PhD dissertation in 1967 was the first in medical image computing, and he has been academically working in that area continuously since his first job at Massachusetts General Hospital in 1962. So since he became the UNC Computer Science faculty in 1967, he has made many collaborations across the UNC Medical School, mostly in neuroscience, radiation oncology, and recently on colonoscopy and on software with the Kitware. So as an educator, Professor Pizer has advised 61 PhD students. That's a very impressive number. In collaboration with Ross Taylor and Nicholas Ayachi, he developed the plan for MICCAI conferences. So he was one of the founders of the MICCAI conferences and involved a lot, made a significant contribution there. Professor Pizer was awarded the MICCAI Fellow in 2010 for a lifelong commitment to advance medical image computing, particularly methodologies for shape statistics and image analysis, and efforts to transfer image technology to the clinic. So Professor Pizer is also an entrepreneur. Since about 1980s, his focus has been on geometric models of anatomic objects, their statistical analysis on non-Euclidean manifolds and clinical applications. The SRAP he's going to talk today, use that for statistics, led to the commercial success of the spin-off Morphomics, now part of the Accuray. So that's a relatively long introduction because he has done so much. Without further ado, let's welcome our speaker. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Pinkun, and thank you for the invitation. I'm really excited about this area that I'm going to be talking about. It's the culmination of about 45 years of research, and I think it's very useful for quite a variety of applications. I want to first give credit to my principal co-authors who are pictured here. Steve Marin, the statistician, Jared Vickery, who was responsible for not only some of the collaborative ideas, but for most of the software, and Mohsen Taheri, whose work on how to compute object means effectively is important. I'm going to talk about correspondence, which is a critical property, and I'm going to be talking about it in reference to the hippocampus, a brain structure that is shown in the middle right. But the method is applicable to a very wide variety of objects, and I'll indicate what. When I say correspondence, if we all hold up our thumb, we will find that there's this tip of the thumb that's a very distinctive sort of place. And if all of our hands are analyzed where we point to the same tip of the thumb, that would be good. But if some of them point to the knuckle as if it were the tip of the thumb, it's going to mess up the statistics. That's lack of correspondence on the boundary. But I'm going to be talking about not only correspondence on the boundary, but correspondence in the interior of the objects as well. And so I'm talking about targeting statistics of objects. What statistics, and these are very common objectives. If you want to decide between a diseased or a normal hippocampus, you want to, that's diagnosis, but statisticians call it classification. You have a shape space and you divide it into the diseased part of the shape space and the normal part. Hypothesis testing is important if you're trying to, for example, understand between disease class entities and normal class entities. And you might decide, for example, that that a particular place on the hippocampus is bent more or another part bulged more, and you want to know which parts, and then inform your biology counterparts about to try to understand why those shape changes. And hypothesis testing is frequently done by permutation tests, which requires comparing two means of two classes in shape space. And the question of how do you compute means is a particular problem that is not done by the normal mean sum of something divided by the number because objects do not live in the flat space that assumes. So they don't live in Euclidean space. Segmentation is a particularly important problem. Before I talk about segmentation, let me give an example by the four examples in the bottom, which are cross sections of hippocampi. Are you seeing my cursor?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. Okay, so the point is you might, for this one, say this cross-section is correspondent to this cross-section in this example, which is correspondent to this cross-section and so on. And not only that, you might decide that, for example, the halfway down this cross-section is correspondent to halfway down this cross-section or some corresponding fraction and so on. The point here is that kind of correspondence is necessary to be able to understand anatomy, because anatomy has to do with the probability distribution of the shape, and that probability distribution depends on having that correspondence. But on top of that, the image intensities at, for example, this place here must be in correspondence to this place here if you're going to do statistics on image intensities. You can't do statistics on XYZ and expect to get reasonable segmentation. You have to do correspondence. You have to be in these object relative coordinates that are in correspondence to look at intensities. And the same thing goes for other properties in the object, for example, mechanical properties that we might talk about, but we'll talk about those later. Okay, going on. Here is the first slide on my take-home messages. The first is what I've already said. Correspondence is critical for good statistical performance. Now, there have been other methods than the one I'm going to describe for correspondence based on entropy, those other methods. And while there's a very attractive idea, it has weakness of being based on an optimization that is both slow and not necessarily converging to the local maximum. And it's also, as it's been implemented, not on a deep enough collection of geometric properties. So the one I'm going to tell you about doesn't have those weaknesses, or put another way, it has significant strengths in that. The next thing is that, as I've said, correspondence is not just needed on the boundary, it's needed in the interior. And a particular contribution here of mine is to figure out what you mean by geometry on the interior and then correspondence on the interior. The next thing is that most of the previous methods for geometric representation use pre-alignment. And that alignment is a bit fraught because it's not completely clear what you might mean by proper alignment. Typically, people use Procrustes, but that's not, doesn't recognize the shape of the object very well. But on top of that, whatever you do, it produces noise or error, which is then compromises the shape analysis. And so the idea is to use local coordinate systems called fitted frames. The frame is the mathematical term for a coordinate system. And the idea is to have such a frame everywhere in the closure of the interior, that is to say, in the interior and the boundary of the object. And all the geometric properties at a point are in the local frame, which means that as you go from one frame to another, we see an ellipsoid here with two frames on it. One each has a normal as one of its frame elements and frame directions, and the other two are in the tangent plane. One of them I'll talk about later is in some special direction in the tangent plane, and the other is in the cross product of the other two. And you see two frames here, and the idea is that for example, curvature properties or vectors on the surface at this point where this frame is will be understood in that frame, whereas over here the frame is a different frame and properties over there are understood in that frame. And because the frames rotate and translate with the object, you need not have any pre-alignment other than the gross pre-alignment of just the top to bottom switch, if you will, which is purely in anatomy purely understood in terms of the location on the boundary. The next thing is that curvature is a particularly important feature. It's a second derivative kind of feature, and that is gotten by the rotation from one frame to another nearby frame. And so these fitted frames are used on the boundary and in the interior in very many positions within and on the boundary of the object. The next major take-home message is that the approach goes from a very basic object. From a skeletal point of view, the simplest object is an ellipsoid. And don't use a sphere. It doesn't have orientation. It's non-generic. It has serious properties. But ellipsoid is great. And it means that it has a medial skeleton, a kind of form of skeleton that is mathematically known. And the idea is to describe the object via a diffeomorphism, a smooth invertible with a smooth inverse deformation of the object and closure of the object interior from the ellipsoid to the object. And I'll describe what this thing that I'm pointing to now is a curved surface that is the skeleton that I'll describe in a moment. But the basic idea is that you're mapping from the skeleton, which is the representation, the skeleton with its, including its vectors to the boundary that we call spokes, from this to that. And we do that in a series of steps. You see here the ellipsoid, and we're going to map its skeleton through a series of steps. It is important that, and each step carefully recognizes a great number of geometric properties. And we found that if you try to do it all in one fell swoop from the ellipsoid to the target object, this target object is a toy object, which is a bent ellipsoid. If you try to do that, it doesn't work as well. You need to evolve this while keeping the geometry. Well, what do I mean by keeping the geometry? Well, first of all, I mean the boundary has to map onto the boundary. Secondly, the crest, which divides the top from the bottom as a high curvature locus, has to map onto the crest. On the crest, there are these special places that are the highest curvature places, Gaussian curvature places that are called vertices that have to map onto vertices as you go through Likewise, the skeleton has to map on the skeleton, and these vectors to the boundary, these spokes have to map onto spokes, and so on and so forth. There's a wide variety of things. I want to point out that this yellow curve here, which is the fold from the top side of this thing to the bottom side, you can think of it as a collapsed version of the hippocampus, where the top side's seen here and you don't see the bottom side. Likewise for this curved surface. This blue curve we call the spine. It is the skeleton of the skeleton, and it's an important locus, you will see. And in fact, the spine, the skeleton of the skeleton of the spine is a nice center point right on the object shown by the dot. Okay, so the model that allows this all to happen is motivated as follows. On the upper right, you see a 2D object. I think we would all say, well, this is a curved object with a bulge in the middle. This is not straightforwardly seen by local geometry on the object. Somehow you want something in the middle that is curved to say that it's curved. And inside it, that something is two-sided. So I want you to, I show it as two separated curves, but they're really co-located on top of each other. So you can understand it is shown as two separate curves. So it is something that has the full topology of this 2D object, except that the top surface and the bottom surface are on top of each other. And it's got to be carefully fit into the object boundary such that its dilation is the object boundary. And this dilation occurs across these spoke vectors that go from it to the boundary in a way non-crossing anywhere in the object. So this is the basic 2D skeletal arrangement. You also see this at the fold here, where it turns over from the top side to the bottom side. The spoke has to go to this this position of greatest curvature, the so-called vertex. Well, in 3D, you have a 3D object, and the same thing happens, sort of. You have something in the center. Now, this diagram here is it needs to be understood as a curved surface in 3 space with a top and a bottom, and you're only seeing the top, and there are a bunch of sampled positions along it. And from every one of those positions on the top side, there is one of these spokes. Actually, that's a sampling of continuous spokes, if you will. And then likewise on the bottom side, there are a series of spokes going to the bottom side of the object. And the fold from the top side to the bottom side, as I said, is this yellow curve. I hope everybody understands that that is a curved surface sort of halfway between the top side of your object and the bottom. And when I say half, I mean approximately half. The point is that now you can talk about something called radial distance, which is the fraction of the way from the surface along each of its spokes to the top side. So radial distance 0 is 0% of the way. That is to say, it's on the skeleton. Radial distance 1, as defined by Damon, is at the boundary. And radial surface, for example, 0.3 is 30% of the way as you go from the skeleton to the boundary. The result is that for each level set of a particular radial distance, a particular fraction, you get one of these onion skins. And so the entire interior of the object is the union of the onion skins is a unique uniquely goes through the whole interior of the object. So now that you have these onion skins, you can do fitted frames on them. And so we see here three examples here on the onion skin at radial distance 1.0, which is the boundary. Here we see the 5 examples of fitted frames. Then at 0.5 radial distance is another shown here, the 5. And for the skeleton, that is to say radial distance 0, we also use 0.25 and 0.75 in our. Now, it may be clear that if you look across the so-called veins that go from the fold to the spine and over to the other fold, that the locus of the spokes to the boundary on the top side and likewise on the bottom side produces a curved surface, which for each one of these veins sweeps the object. And the whole notion of the objects that can be captured in this particular topology, and I'll later talk about other topologies, but anyway, for this topology, has to do with the ability to sweep with this curved surface. Now, Damon has produced some very nice geometry when the sweeping surface is planar, and Harry's method for finding geometrically valid means that depends on sweeping with planes rather than curved surfaces. Okay, so now that you have this, if we do fitting in a way that captures the most important geometric properties, a very rich set in the object, we're going to get correspondence because those are the things that are shared across the population of objects that we want to do our statistics on. And in that case, the following 3 variables give a coordinate system for the interior that's object-oriented. That is to say, that's correspondent. So the first one is the spine. I want you to understand that this skeleton has a top and a bottom, and it folds over at the end of the spine. The spine itself goes over, and so you can talk about this being 0, pi over 2, underneath pi, over here, 3 pi over 2, and back over the top, 2 pi. This is a fraction of the way along the spine. That's theta. Tau 1 is the coordinate that goes from one side of the fold to the other side of the fold, and it also has a sign so that it goes on the top side with one sign SIGN and on the other side. And tau 2 is what I've already talked about as radial distance. So the point is that you have a fraction of the way around the spine, fraction of the way along the vein, and fraction of the way along the spokes. The result is that this method gives shape property that is invariant to proportional lengthening of the object, proportional widening of the object, and proportional deepening, if you will, of the object. And the idea is that if you're at position theta, tau 1, tau 2 in one instance of the population, and you're in another instance, the one that's in correspondence to the first is also at theta, it's same value of theta, tau 1, tau 2. If there are questions, Pinkun will field them and let me know. Questions of clarity. Okay, so then, as I said, the frames are fitted to the onion skins. In our experiments, we used 5 onion skins. And at each onion skin, you have the same implied grid. And at all those 3D grid points, we compute curvatures in 3 directions. And and we compute interposition vectors in those directions. I want to emphasize that vectors have a direction component, and directions live on spheres, which are not flat spaces. Curvatures, likewise, are actually live on a three-sphere, whereas directions live on our ordinary two spheres. That is to say, a two-dimensional sphere or a three-dimensional sphere. And those things that live on spheres, you can't do ordinary statistics on, because ordinary statistics depends on Euclidean distances. And so there's a process called principal nested spheres that I don't have time to go into unless later asked, but it's a generalization of PCA that yields new features that that you can do Euclidean geometry on, and thus use the standard statistics. Okay, so as I've said, the basic idea then is to first of all start from your object. Here's my toy bent ellipsoid, and apply a smoothing and straightening algorithm that I'll talk about shortly. Then fit the SREP to it mathematically. It's a mathematical computation, and then to go from it stage by stage by stage, and at every stage recognizing the correspondent boundaries, the correspondent crests, the correspondent vertices, and these include, by the way, the folds and it turns out that you want the fold of the SREP, the fold of the skeleton, to have its spoke go to the crest, and the vertices of the skeleton to go to the vertices of the object. You want the spokes to stay straight as you map one spoke to the corresponding spoke. You want onion skins to map onto onion skins. It's a very, very this geometry that's derived from into the anterior is very, very rich, and importantly makes this evolution reflect this rich geometry of the object. So the name of the game is the forward flow from the target object first to the ellipsoid. We presently use Kazhdan's very nice conformalized mean curvature flow. You see an example of it on the top for the bent ellipsoid. Here you see the example from an object that is not slabular by itself, but after a little bit of smoothing is, and we apply it to the hippocampus in our case as well, and it smooths and straightens. Unfortunately, it does so in a way not nicely recognizing the geometric changes that I've been talking about. It doesn't map crests onto crests or vertices onto vertices. And by the way, the most common and highly thought of by me too, large deformation diffeomorphic metric mapping, LDDMM method, doesn't do that either. But in any case, once you get that, you have all these boundaries and crests and so on down here. And then this backward flow is the evolution. And the deal is that as you go from one stage of this to the next, from here to here or from here to here, you are recognizing not only the properties of the boundary and the crests and the vertices and so on that you have up here, but also all of these other properties of keeping the center about the skeleton about being roughly central. That is to say, the top and bottom spokes at a point should be penalized from being different in length. You also want approximate orthogonality at the boundary. You want the spacing along the skeleton proportionally to stay the same, and so on. And that happens stage to stage. And when you get that evolution back to the end, you've got the representation, the so-called evolutionary SREP, that I think is a particularly important representation of the object. Okay, so we have the so-called forward flow followed by backward flow. Okay, so this sounds like maybe it's interesting, but does it work? And so to do that, we did a target diagnosis or classification in two classes, one with a disorder and one not. You'll see that the disorder we tested it on is autism. And you have N cases of which N1 are in one class and N sub 2 in another. And the from each we have an SREP, and the SREP we did I talk about? Yeah, down here we have at each one of the 3D grid, if you will, both these vectors in a couple of directions produce in three, and then all these curvatures in three directions, producing in our example a total of just over 8,000 Euclideanized features, and then this 8,000 tuple is dealt with each one of the ones that live on spheres by Euclideanization by principal nested spheres, and then we cut down to n-1 linear combinations of those because you can only get that many linearly independent features. So we have n-1 an n-1 dimensional space. In our case, that's a 177 dimensional space, I believe. In any case, that we now have that 177 tuple on each one of these n1 plus n2 n equals n cases. And then we apply random holdouts. Other people call that cross-validation. The idea is for each holdout, you take 80% of the ones in class 1, and it's a random set, and with the remaining 20% as test, 80% in class 1, 80% in class 2, 20% and 20% in each class. On the basis of the 80%, you do distance-weighted discrimination. By the way, anybody who uses support vector machines shouldn't. Distance-weighted discrimination works better, and later there's a place where you can find that. But in any case, it produces, like support vector machines, a separation direction in this space, in this 177 dimensional space. And then you apply that separation direction to the remaining 20% in each class. It produces contributions to an ROC, and you do that for many, many, many of these holdouts. We used 1,000, and you get an area under that ROC. Because one has unbalanced training cases and also because you would like to emphasize the positive cases. In this case, positive means the ones with autism. You also useful to compute a precision recall area, and these are averaged over all the holdouts to produce the values. Okay, so what did we do? Well, we first of all over the years had been comparing to reasonably produced point distribution models with the reasonable production based on spherical harmonics, and we very much won. Our method seriously got better area under the ROC or area under the precision recall curve than it. But we wanted to compare ourselves to what was considered the best method for shape. And so it's an LDDM method. And I want to explain that briefly so that you can understand the comparison. So basically, LDDMM first requires it based only on the boundary, and based on the boundary you compute a mean, and we're talking about the diffeomorphism from the mean to the target entity in each instance. That is to say, from the mean hippocampus to the specific hippocampus. It turns out that that's represented by a diffeomorphism that can be understood by its initial velocity, which is a series of vectors in a voxel set in this three space that at every voxel you have an initial direction or linear combination of that that's called a momentum. We use both forms where this thing was represented by a tile mesh, triangular tile mesh on the boundary, or binary image, and one of them used a momentum and the other used this initial velocity. But in any case, the representation of the LDDMM is 3 times the number of voxels in this space, including the object. And when you do either one of these, the diffeomorphism using the Defometrica code, you get an area under the ROC of 53%. Well, 50% is pure guessing. Essentially, this particular problem is very, very challenging. So let me tell you what the problem is. The problem is that you have hippocampi, which is thought through somehow autistic things to be somehow resident in the hippocampi among other brain structures. And the idea is to be able to diagnose autism based on the shape of 6-month-olds hippocampi, where the actual diagnosis that is accepted doesn't appear until you have the behavioral symptoms that show up maybe at age 4. This is a very, very, very tough. We consciously produce a very, very tough shape classification problem. No human can unsee the changes between the two classes, and neither can the Defometrica that the two forms give 0.53 and 0.58 under the ROCs. They're barely better than guessing. Whereas our evolutionary SREPs produces 73% area under the ROC, and the same advantage, where increasing value of the area under the precision recall curve is also seen. So I am not claiming that 73% is diagnostic. In fact, my colleagues at the Neuroimage Research and Analysis Lab have done this, including a whole bunch of cerebral cortex-based things, and you get well up in the 90% there. But we wanted here to see what we could get from just this one structure. And then the other value here with 0.6 is if you try to do it in one fell swoop, you don't do the evolution. And yeah, you get slightly better than the LDDMM method, but nowhere near as good if you do the evolution. Okay, this is fine, but the calculation that is produced here, actually the slow part is that each one of these stages has an initial application of LDDMM, which is the slow part of what, and then there's because as I said, that one doesn't recognize these important evolution, these properties that need to correspond. You need a fix-up step as well. But anyway, it's the Defometrica application is the slow part of this calculation, and on my laptop, a modern laptop, it takes 20 minutes to do one. On a high-quality desktop, it takes 5 minutes, but you'd like to go much faster. Gagnon, Ferrante, and Vickery showed that they can train a neural net given pairs of just uh, variety of bent ellipsoids, uh, and then use transfer learning that only requires a few dozen cases of the hippocampus to specialize it to that problem, and that produces a deep neural net, which at least in terms of the Euclidean properties of it were shown to be very good results, and that is something that can go in 2 seconds rather than 5 minutes. Moreover, if this guy, each one of these is embedded in an intensity distribution, including the hippocampi, you can, in fact, carry it through this conformalized mean curvature flow and then make the corresponding steps on the backward flow include not only geometric, but also correspondent and intensity properties. And that, I believe, we haven't done it, but would go along, could be generalized to give you intensity mapping to SREPs, and then this applied to produce a neural net segmenter. And so this talks a little bit about how that flow would work. But anyway, the idea is, as I said, on the backward flow to include image intensity properties. And the major point here is that if you have a whole bunch of training examples, you can get a probability distribution of the SREP components and a probability, which is shape probability, and a probability distribution of the images in SREP-based coordinates. That is to say, theta, tau 1, tau 2, and those can be used. Those can be used as loss functions in training your segmentation, because the sum of those two is the probability of being that you want to optimize. That is to say, the probability of the object representation, the probability of the SREP given the image. Okay, the final piece of the story is the problem of computing means. Every method of computing means of objects that I know of has an unfortunate property. Even though all of the objects in the population have no self-intersection, and when I say self-intersection, I mean that something in the interior and ultimately on the boundary passes over and back on itself. Even though none of the ones have that property, the instances, when you take their mean by any of the standard approaches, the result can have self-intersection. The problem essentially is that when you compute means, you are talking about the Fouché mean, that is to say, the locus in feature space that that such that the sum of the squares of the geodesic distances from the instances to it are minimum. And unfortunately, all the shape spaces include invalid cases. And indeed, it may even end up at that. So the geodesic distances are problematic. And so anyway, the point here is that all methods until Taheri's method has this potential problem. And here you see an example of a button down here, a bunch of examples of colons, to which one that doesn't avoid these doesn't have this way of producing better means, that fail to have these invalid ones in the shape space, and it does indeed produce a mean colon with self-intersections, whereas the new one doesn't. And by the way, the ordinary Procrustes mean produces something completely ridiculous. Anyway, how does this method work? Well, first of all, it depends on having a sweeping of planes rather than curved surfaces, at least as presently implemented. And you have this spine, which is the centers of the intersections. Moreover, in Taheri's method, you have to have elliptical cross sections. It's a special case of an SREP. At each plane, you have these planar ellipses that are swept here, and then you have something that Damon talked about as the relative curvature criterion, which is the product of the curvature kappa of the curve times the distance from the to the closest place, to the farthest place, I'm sorry, on the ellipse, cross-sectional ellipse. And that has to be less than 1. And if you make a shape space that satisfies that, then indeed you can guarantee that that shape space only, it's now RCC satisfying, can avoid this self-intersection problem. So conclusions. Correspondence using second-order geometric features, no pre-alignment, and evolutionary fitting is a powerful approach to improve statistics over alternative methods. Correspondence to critical, and by the way, I hope others will take this method and apply it to other disorders and other disorders and other objects, anatomic objects, and see if it works as well on those. These critical loci are important that I talked about. The fitted frames is an important generalization, not just to the boundary, where this idea was applied first by Carton in Élie Carton in 1910, but also now in the interior. It has these two nice properties of avoiding alignment and providing interior second-order geometry. And then this RCC, or relative curvature criterion consistency, would be best for SREP means. Finally, a few words on implementation. There is a program available online called SALT, Shape Analysis Toolkit. You can upload it. I have a copy open right now, and I'll show it to you. But anyway, it works for all major operating systems. It has open source Python code and very nice tutorials. And among the many programs that it has is the SREP fitting one. I have two of its Windows menu items open, one called Shape Creation, where you see evolutionary SREP fitting as one of the capabilities, but it fits others. Under shape analysis, you see this distance weighted discrimination. Population analysis includes PCA and PNS, this regression, and so on and so forth. This models window allows you to display, and for example, to display the SREP opposite the boundary surface that it was fit to. There's a bunch of, if you look under this skeleton topology, you will find a bunch of statistics on the evolutionary SRIPs. I want to close with give a shout out to give credit to my many co-authors. The one I want to especially note is Jim Damon. Unfortunately, he died a couple of years ago. I miss him as a friend. I miss him deeply as a mathematician. I want to ask him questions all the time that unfortunately I can't any longer. And acknowledgments to a variety of other people and the support, monetary support. I went very quickly through the ideas of SREPs. There's a whole article, a paper on that you'll find in Frontiers in Computer Science. There are the two papers by me and by Mohsen Taheri on the respective topics that you can look up and read. And my final the very final thing I want to say is that there's a lot of things that can be done, and a number of them are listed here. You would like to have the correspondence not just represent shape, which is what we've done in its producing correspondence, but image intensity features or biological features and genetic features, for example, in space, or mechanical features. So you want to have correspondence that reflect, for example, how the object bends or compresses or what have you. And then you're talking about like the beating heart, for example. You'd like also to be able to do multiple objects. We have done, Jurian Liu, who was just listed, did one with the caudate nucleus and the hippocampus, but not only that, but also a geometric representation of the relationship between the two. And so that three tuple, in fact, beat just doing the hippocampus alone in terms of its behavior. And then there are these objects with protrusions. A little bit of this smoothing, straightening gets rid of these protrusions, produce something you can do an SREP on, and then you want to talk about how to represent the protrusion and what its geometric relationship is to the host. So I close with and way to access me. This talk will be recorded, so if people want to hear it again or have others listen to it, it will be available to you. I note this distance-weighted discrimination method, which is because it uses all the data, is available in SALT, but also online in other places, and respectively MATLAB, R, and Python. So I'm open to questions at this point. Thanks for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your interesting presentation, Professor Pizer. We have several questions on the chat. Let me start reading them. Hi, Dr. Pizer. You say locational correspondence of objects across the population is critical for good statistical performance, including segmentation. Does that mean algorithms and tools that run automated segmentation also demand all of its test subjects to be aligned as per its training dataset in general?
No, not at all. That's the beauty of this method. It's alignment free. If you want to, let's be careful. If you want to do segmentation, the alignment features can be important features. So the rotation, for example, of the object into some for example, it's from its mean, may be important. The translation may be important. Those can be used as additional features over and above the shape features that I've talked about. But the shape features themselves don't require any alignment. The issue of alignment is only important if those alignment features are also important for your segmentation.
Great. Another question. Have you tested similar methods to 2D medical shapes? What needs to be adjusted?
Okay, so first of all, the ones that I've talked about are ones with spherical topology, the objects that anatomic, that is to say, ones that have no hole either through it or within it, and ones that we call slabular, which are swept ones. The two classes of objects that don't have that property. Okay, first of all, I make no representation that we handle branching objects, although there are some possibilities there. I'm not talking about branching objects. But of the many objects have the spherical topology, but many have other topologies. So Jared Vickery, for example, is doing a heart valve as an object, and the heart valve is something with cylindrical topology. Basically, it's a cylinder with fattened surface. that closes and opens. That he has shown, and it's fairly clear that you can equally well talk about skeletons for that topology, and then the method works very nicely. And in fact, he's working on SREP in motion statistics with that. Likewise, we've done toroidal topology, where there's a through hole in some objects. And then as long as the population stays within that topology and doesn't cross topologies, you can very nicely talk about a skeletal method for any others. The other class of entities are, first of all, multi-object ones. And when I say multi-objects, they may be separated objects, but they may importantly be objects within objects. So, for example, the ventricles of the heart, the cardiac ventricles within the heart, or the pancreas has special regions within it that you want to them to understand where they are in the coordinate system of the host. Likewise, these protrusions and indentations with serious curvature, all those are open problems that I would very much like to see people work on, and I am available at the email site that you see here on the screen for collaboration, consulting, whatever, as you try these methods on those.
Excellent. One more question. In the era of deep learning and transformers, where the networks are self-generating the features, how do these methods compare and which yield better classification?
Okay. This is, again, open research that has not been done. I told you that this work by Gagnon et al., which included my colleague Jared Vickery, was evaluated in terms of the ability of the SREP and its implied boundary as compared to the target objects in known results, but based on Euclidean comparison and not based on the performance, for example, for classification or hypothesis testing or segmentation. That also is open research. I am hopeful and expectant that those methods would show probably not quite as good performance as using the whole somewhat time-consuming, but not ridiculously time-consuming per training case SREP fitting. But that is a question. It's a very good question that needs to be answered.
Great. And last question. I do not understand how the SREP features correspond between different individuals when there is not a simple scale difference, but if different parts of the object to model are of different size. Assume you want to model a leg. Some people have shorter legs, but larger feet. Others have longer legs and smaller feet. How is a correspondence established between the angle of such two people?
Okay, so first of all, in the example, if you're talking about legs that run into feet, and let's talk about the lower leg as an example. The point is that while the feet may be longer or shorter, or the legs may be longer or shorter, what they have in common are these geometric features that correspond to having a heel, having an ankle that bends at certain angles, and likewise the leg having a cuff that's wider than at the ankle, and so on. And the whole point of this method is that instead of being mathematical description, it's an algorithm description based on deep mathematically described geometric properties. And the point is that these common properties will make because the backward flow insists that these properties essentially map onto each other, you end up with the fact that the feet, longer or shorter, are handled very specifically in how the fitting is done in common across the population. And it's that beauty of reflecting these deep geometric properties that makes this method handle situations like the questioner asked.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen. 1 hour goes by very quickly with such a wonderful talk. It's time to conclude our session today. So everyone, see you online. Please join me thanking our speaker again. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us today and for all the thoughtful discussions and questions. We look forward to seeing you again in our upcoming talks. Please stay tuned for the future announcement. See you next time. Thank you,
Thank you
Stephen,
very
Thank you very
much
again.
for
much.
listening.
Yeah,
Thank you.
take care.